Judith Butler is an author who needs no introduction. They have been writing and teaching about feminist philosophy since before I was born. And while I've spent many years enjoying interviews and statements made by Butler, I've never been able to, or at least felt comfortable with, actually sitting down and reading any of their books before, because Butler's books are typically seen as very specialist, very academic. But Who's Afraid of Gender is the first Judith Butler book that was written for the layman, for the general public, for anyone who is seeking a deeper understanding of the current conversation around this phantasm called gender. Phantasm, by the way, is the word that Butler uses all the way through this book. If you've read anything by Karl Marx or any Marxist theory, which I have, you'll know that phantasm is kind of borrowed from Marxist philosophy. Butler frequently references Marx, especially in the introduction, which is easily the heaviest part of this book. And if you do end up reading this book, just know that the introduction is entirely written in Academese, but the rest of the book is a lot easier to follow and swallow. Now, before I completely lose my shit, which I am going to do, let's just talk about what Who's Afraid of Gender actually is. Who's Afraid of Gender is a work of political non-fiction, and its title is a very literal thing. This book is literally asking the question, who's afraid of gender? In the introduction, Judith Butler spells out what gender here means. And as I've already said, gender is a phantasm. It is a loose concept or ideology which conservatives and conservative sympathizers have turned into a kind of monster which threatens the global way of life, whatever that means. Gender is an umbrella term that covers multiple things, but most obviously, almost like an elephant in the room, gender is very heavily about trans and non-binary people. But it also includes other kinds of feminist ideology. It includes other groups within the LGBTQ+ community. It includes cisgender women's reproductive rights. It is very tightly tethered to other phantasms like critical race theory and wokeism. And so this book, chapter by chapter, looks at the different kinds of powers that seem to fear, or at least incite fear of, gender ideology. Those groups include the US government, the Vatican, the UK government, and other religious and political groups around the world. The book very literally asks, who is afraid of gender? It then tells us who these people are, what exactly they believe, or at least what they tell other people to believe, the ways in which they scapegoat minority groups like trans people and even just women, and very occasionally, when Butler feels up to it, the book offers some counter-arguments against the toxic and dangerous and oppressive thought processes and behaviors of these groups. Though certainly not as often as I'd like. Now, as you can see here, I have dog-eared and highlighted a lot of this book. In part because there were a lot of things to learn, things that I genuinely appreciated, but also because so many of the things that I highlighted were fuel for my big question. Butler is asking, who's afraid of gender? I'm asking, who the hell is this book for? See, this is not a work of philosophy, and it is not a manifesto, as I kind of hoped it would be. As someone who's never been able to read Butler before because I am not a trained academic in this field, I hoped that this book would change my world. It would enlighten me, it would inspire me, and it would maybe even equip myself and others with the tools to fight back somehow against the totalitarian behaviors of the groups that are oppressing us. No. Flat out no. This is not a manifesto. This book does not contain anything that is actionable or even inspiring. And Butler says as much, clarifies as much in the introduction. This is how the introduction ends. I will attempt to reconstruct some of the arguments waged against gender and to respond in the best way I know how. And though I do want to show that both right-wing and trans-exclusive arguments against gender are wrong or not rightly formulated, my primary aim is not simply argumentative, academic, or philosophical. As I hope is clear, my question is, what kind of phantasm has gender become? And what anxieties, fears, and hatreds does it collect and mobilize? Those who oppose gender are living with a sense of conviction that something is in fact destroying their world, their embodied sense of self in the world, the social structures without which they will not survive. I am hoping then to try to understand the phantasmatic dimension of gender, as it appears to those who call for the elimination of gender education, the censorship of texts concerned with gender, and the disenfranchisement or criminalization of transgender or genderqueer people. This is a book that lays out what those people think, how they feel, what fuels their fire, what laws are being passed against us, what threatens our way of life, etc., etc. But why? I couldn't understand the end game of this book, and it has deeply frustrated me. Let's for a second compare Who's Afraid of Gender to Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici. I love this book. I would call this a life-changing book. Caliban and the Witch, as I've talked about in another video, is a history book, but it's also political and philosophical. It very deeply and satisfyingly explores the relationship between capitalism and patriarchy. It details the rise of capitalism over the past 500 years in Europe and what effect that had on the relationship between men and women, between women and their own bodies, and so much more. This is a truly enlightening work of history, economics, politics, and so much more. I felt empowered by it because I was instilled with so much knowledge, so much political and economic philosophy I did not know. I feel so enriched and empowered by this because the knowledge it put in my brain felt like a weapon. I better understand the structures of capitalism and patriarchy because of this book, and thus I feel empowered because knowledge is power. I cannot say any of that about this book. Who's Afraid of Gender, I hoped would do something very, very similar. That it would provide me with information that felt like a tool, felt like a weapon, felt enriching and empowering. Absolutely not. Because I don't know who this book is for. All the way through the book, Judith Butler refers to the people who hate us. The TERFs, the gender criticals, the UK and US governments, the conservatives at large, in the third person. They are othered, they are them. They are outside of this conversation. Thus, Butler knows that the people who would be best served reading this book will not read it. And they're right. Butler is completely right in saying that. I know that the conservatives that hate and fear us, the ones who are afraid of gender, will not read it, even though it would serve them well. I know that doubly for sure, because I was on Instagram and I saw Penguin post a picture of this book, and suddenly there was a deluge of comments from the exact people the book is talking about. Hateful, bigoted, spiteful comments from them. And I'm sure there'll be a few of them in the comments. Welcome. So this book is not for them. Butler knows that, I know it, you know it. But it's not for me either, because almost every step of the way, I kept reading this fucking book and thinking, I know. I really don't want to come across here as arrogant, like I'm as clever as Judith Butler, that I'm as knowledgeable, that I've done as much research, that I'm as philosophically enlightened. I'm just woke. I just know this stuff. I know it because I check the news. I know it because I'm a transgender YouTuber who gets hate on the reg. I know how these people think. I've been to protest marches. I talk to other trans and non-binary people every single day. I have conservative parents. I watch YouTube videos and read articles analysing the words of J.K. Rowling and Kelly J. Keane. I read news articles every day about all the bills that are getting passed in different US states. I read and watch and listen to statements made by politicians in my country. I, like most queer people, am awake to this. I know all of this. I know how these people think. I know what they want. I know what they're trying to do. I understand the concept of scapegoating. I understand how conservative fears work. The fact that they're not really fears. Like Butler says, gender is a phantasm created by the conservatives, by the right wing, to frighten people into hating us. For their benefit, in order for them to consolidate power. I've read 1984. I know this stuff. And I'm willing to bet most of the people who are enticed by this book, who are attracted to it, who would want to read it, who would want to spend money on it like I did, will all know this stuff too. The people who would benefit from this book most will not read it. And those of us who are part of this conversation already know most of this stuff. So who's it for? But to give the book its credit, there was a lot that I learned. Either bits of information that I'd never learned, or more importantly and more valuably, ways of seeing these things that I'd never considered. That's probably the most powerful thing that this book does. It provides us with new angles, new ways of seeing these people, the gender criticals, the conservatives, the TERFs, whatever. For the most part, it felt useless because it just tells us what they think and how they think it, and I already know that, but occasionally it gives you new angles and new snippets of information. Every single chapter I learned something. I'm not saying the book is entirely useless. I'm just saying that it has no cohesive purpose, no thesis. So here are a few fascinating things that I learned from this book, partly so that all of my time highlighting wasn't a waste. In the first chapter, called The Global Scene, there's this bit. By comparing gender ideology to both nuclear war and Nazism, Pope Francis has galvanized those who oppose both the LGBTQ+ movement and feminism into thinking that they are waging a just war against the forces of destruction. That's a wild statement. That's something I did not know. I've not paid much attention to what the Catholic Church has been saying with regards to gender and gender ideology. It bummed me out, but I've never cared about the Catholic Church, and I did find it interesting. It was eye-opening in a minor way. One thing that I'll admit I found very enlightening was in chapter 3, which is titled Contemporary Attacks on Gender in the United States. There's a lot in this chapter about lawmakers and the ways in which they phrase their bills, the way they phrase their narratives, in order to justify banning books and banning so many woke things from education. For example, here, the idea that being exposed to an idea is enough to be indoctrinated by it assumes a seamless and quick passage from thought to conviction, bypassing all judgment and evaluation. The youthful mind is tacitly figured in these instances as fully porous or helplessly responsive to a penetrative power, as if to be exposed to a word or a thought is to be penetrated against one's will. And it goes on to say, those making allegations about indoctrination do not simply refuse to see what actually happens in educational environments. They know that developing autonomous judgment is an educational goal. And they fear that potential, that freedom to think, more than they fear indoctrination. Those who defend censorship, who make allegations of ideology under the rubric of woke, are interested in maintaining doctrinal control in education, very often allying with parental rights over public education. I knew that second part. It's very obvious what these people are doing and why they do it and how they do it. But I'd never thought about the porousness of the brain, the idea that these people think that everything is indoctrination. And a lot of this book covers that. The idea that conservative people, gender critical people, whatever, they think that we think how they think. They indoctrinate, they oppress, they build walls, they pass laws in order to suppress us, in order to alienate us, in order to indoctrinate. And because it's almost natural for them to do that, they think it's what we're doing. They call gender ideology indoctrination because indoctrination is a thing that they understand. It's a thing that I guess they want to do, and they do. They don't think for a second that other people think differently. They think that a kid learning about the existence of gay parents will somehow destroy that child, and so they will destroy that child in their own ways. This is a very interesting bit of political psychology, but Butler isn't a political psychologist and doesn't go any further with this. It was a moment that I really sat and thought, and I really enjoyed it. But everything I was thinking about was in my head alone. It's not in this book. And so I had nowhere to go with those thoughts. They couldn't be taken any further. One thing that I was really excited about was Butler honing in specifically on TERFism in the UK, because it's different. The religious and conservative values of American lawmakers and the American people, they are powerful things. The US is led by these traditions, led by Christianity and Jesus. And so Jesus and tradition are things that are so easily weaponized in the United States. That's not really the case in the UK. UK transphobia is different, and I was really excited to see how Butler made sense of all of that, how Butler reconciled that and explained it to me. Why is it that TERFism and gender-critical behaviour in the UK feels different to how it feels in so many other countries? The transphobic talking heads in this country do not speak to traditional family values, do not speak to conservative Christian values. They speak differently. And Butler explains all of it. But I already knew it. Everything that Butler explains, I knew. What I wanted was an explanation as to why, and you don't get it. Butler does make a deeply personal statement here that I quite liked. On the face of it, it is stunning and sad to see feminists engage in acts of discrimination after so many years of fighting for laws against sex discrimination. This is something that breaks my heart when I see transphobes, TERFs, gender criticals out in the UK, doing their marches, making their statements on Twitter, and they fly feminist colours. They fly the flags of the suffragettes. It breaks my heart because feminism is about fighting against patriarchal oppression, and they are aiming their weapons at the wrong people. Feminism is about gaining rights, and then these people look at us, people who are also asking for rights, and they use those same colours to oppress us. It is heartbreaking stuff. After this point, Butler goes on to say, when TERFs claim that their gender is appropriated, they concede in effect that they think of their sex as property, something stolen from them. But they still exist within the genders they have, so what precisely has changed? Has anything truly been lost or taken away? Self-definition is an age-old feminist prerogative. So why forfeit that now in the name of an authority both paternalistic and proprietary? It is hard to understand why the life of a trans woman should threaten in any way the life of a woman who has kept her original sex assignment. And again, this is just Butler speaking my own fears and frustrations. The transphobic women in the UK often side with the conservative patriarchal forces that oppress them in order to oppress us. It is heartbreaking. But in this book, Judith Butler offers no argument against them, offers no real deep explanation as to why they think and feel the way that they do. Instead, just points out these facts, things that I already fucking know. But before I stop and I completely lose myself, there was one thing in this book that I took away and I really, really cherished. And it is a well-formed argument against the people who see trans women as men who want to exert oppression and physical violence and other forces against cis women. And I'm just going to read it to you. Consider the irony that the women most feared for having a penis may be among those most disinterested in having one. Why should they, of all people, carry the brunt of masculine violence? Trans women, one of the most vulnerable groups, a group that includes those who may or may not have penises, have already disidentified from traditional masculinity, and in many, if not most cases, know, suffer, and resist masculine violence in their everyday lives. How foolish then not to realize the alliance at hand between trans people and feminists of all kinds, especially when so often they are not distinct groups at all. Trans feminism makes this clear, drawing on the intersectional approach developed by black feminism and developing a new framework that moves beyond the divisions considered here. Masculinity does not have to remain tied to the framework of domination and violation, as many newer forms of masculinity attest, especially in queer and trans communities. Butler ends this statement brilliantly by pointing out that trans men and gay men and other men within the queer community are almost creating new forms of masculinity, forms that are certainly not oppressive, patriarchal, toxic, dangerous, assertive, violent, or anything else. It brings me back to the statement, something I think about all the time, is that the people you should fear are the cis-het men. They're the ones making the laws, they're the ones abusing, they're the ones oppressing, they're the ones committing violent attacks. Trans women like myself feel no affinity for or association with anything masculine, anything patriarchal. And so why do these people aim their sights at us and align with patriarchal powers while doing it? I really, really valued this point in particular. I thought it was fantastic. That section there was really eye-opening. And there's plenty more besides, little bits here and there in every single chapter all the way through that's very, very eye-opening. But it's not enough to justify the overall structure and message of this thing. Because ultimately this is just a book of information, stuff that I already know, stuff that so many people already know, especially those who are most likely to read the fucking thing. I've taken a few snippets here and there, which feel kind of argumentative, philosophical, useful in some way. I said at the beginning I wanted information as a weapon, and I've highlighted a few bits here and there, and I've read them out to you. But they are few and far between. Most of this book is just telling us how these people think, what they do with their time, the power they exert, the laws that they pass. And I just kept thinking, I know. So who is this book for? The things I just read out are great arguments against TERFs. If there are any transphobic women who find their way into my comment section, who find their way to this video, those statements are great arguments against the toxic, awful, oppressive, patriarchal things that you people think and say on a daily basis. But those statements are so few and far between. Everything else is just information I knew. Who is this book for? I am going to ask that question until I'm blue in the face, and you don't need to be here for it. I don't know who this book is for. I don't know who will feel ultimately enlightened by it. I don't know what purpose it's really trying to serve. You can cherry pick valuable bits of information here and there, and that's about it. It is deeply frustrating. Subscribe for books.